Every adventurer has their reasons for striking out on the open road, whether it's fame, gold, anonymity. But what if there were a way that you could take those reasons, take the backstory of a character, and mechanically have it affect and influence the game? Let's talk about obligation. What is up, everybody? Welcome back to the Geek Pantheon. I am Eric, and today I'm here to talk to you about my favorite stolen mechanic from any tabletop role-playing game to use in your D&D game. I really enjoy this mechanic. I've spoken about it before in another video I did about various mechanics that you can steal, link up there. And I wanted to do a bit of a deep dive on it today because it's something that I currently use on Eberron Renewed, our actual play podcast, which admittedly doesn't use D&D as the system, but I think it's really easy to port over into the system. And I think in any future games that I run, I'm probably going to bring it over. So what we're talking about is the Fantasy Flight Games Star Wars RPG obligation mechanic from their Edge of the Empire game. And so what this does is it takes an element of a character's backstory, a player character's backstory, and makes it a significant part of their story moving forward. It is something from their past that affects their present and potentially their future. And the idea is that anybody that lives the life of an adventurer probably has something behind them that has the potential to haunt them, or at least influence the decisions that they're going to make moving forward. And so how can we take a mechanic and make that realized within the game, make it actually matter outside of storytelling in the game? And you all know me, I'm all about mechanics informing the story. And so anytime I can bring a mechanic in that's going to be able to work in the background, but further reinforce and inform that story, it's a match made in heaven. So first off, before we get into the what is this mechanic, I want to talk about why you would want to use this. Let me give you my sales pitch on why I think this is a great mechanic before I even tell you what the mechanic does. So first off, it provides compelling motivations that you can bake into player characters' backgrounds. It's easy for a lot of players, especially ones that are newer or don't really invest a whole lot of thought and time into their backstory. People that are here for the combat typically a lot of times will just do a fairly bog standard backstory just so they can move on and make their character, and that's totally fine. Everybody plays this game for their own reasons. But bringing this mechanic in will at least, for lack of a better term, force your players to at least focus in on one thing, one element that has affected them in the past and that they need to reconcile moving forward with their life. I like that. I like having that kind of thing baked into the game. Additionally, when everybody comes together at session 0 or session 1 and are sharing their characters with each other and they get to their obligations and they're sharing those, that can tell you so much about a player character, about what element of their backstory did they think was so important that they wanted to elevate it to be the thing that continues to carry forward. And I think it can speak a lot about characters, like a character that picks vengeance rather than a character that picked love, or a character that picked betrayal, or a character that picked family. All these different things can mean a lot and really convey a lot about your character. And then my last big reason why I love this, and this is for the DMs out there or the players, this is something that I feel like you all would enjoy hearing about too. It provides a really interesting mechanical way to highlight different characters' stories in the game, a very codified way to where the way that I run it, nobody's caught off guard. Like if somebody is going to be heavily featured in an upcoming session, they know about it ahead of time. They can prep before they come to the game. And it provides a really interesting way that's still randomized. You're still rolling dice, but you can incorporate your players' stories, your player character stories into sessions in really interesting ways, and it will sometimes force you as the dungeon master to think creatively. If somebody's obligation becomes activated for a session that you weren't expecting, and maybe you had like, no, that this part of the story, we need to get this thing done. Well, it's like, okay, you still get that thing done, but how is this player character's family going to play a role in that story now? Because that's their obligation and they rolled it. So make something happen. If it's a big set piece with the villain, They kidnapped a family member. Like, I mean, that's just a very reductive, simplistic way of thinking about it. But you can get creative, you can do all kinds of cool things, and it gives you a mechanical, codified way of doing it, which I really like. So let's talk about what is this mechanic? What is obligation? So in Fantasy Flight Games, Star Wars role-playing game, obligation is the thing that you take on at character creation. And at its most base level, it allows you to get extra money or experience at character creation to get abilities and ranks in different skills and stuff like that. So yeah, because Star Wars it doesn't do a traditional leveling system like D&D. But yeah, that's the initial function of obligation is you pick what your obligation is, and then you can take on additional obligation to get more resources at character creation if you want. And these obligations reflect your character's life before the campaign. A perfect example within the fiction of where this mechanic originated, Han Solo's debt to Jabba the Hutt. In A New Hope, it is not at all relevant to the story. At all. But it's a very big thing to Han Solo. It's something that defines his character, something from his past that is defining his venture forward. And it ends up later on affecting the story in a pretty big way, but it's not the main story. It's a side quest. He gets captured. The party has to divert from their mission to support the rebellion, to take out the Empire, to go rescue Han from this crime lord that he owed money to. It's a side quest. It's a session where a player has to go be rescued. A player character has to go be rescued. And so when you think about it that way, I think it's much easier to think about obligations. Like, what is the thing that has the potential to affect your current life? Yeah, every player character has a numerical value assigned to their obligation. It starts off at 10 when you're creating a character, and then you can take on additional obligation up to 20 at character creation to get more stuff. And then, according to Raw, rules as written, at the end of a session, you roll a D100 and you stack all of your players' obligation together. So PC1 is assigned 1 through 10, and then the next PC is 11 through 20. And then maybe the next PC has an obligation of 20, so they're 21 through 40, and so on and so forth. And then when you roll the D100, if you roll above the collective PC obligation, then nothing happens. Your campaign just proceeds as normal. So starting off, if nobody took additional obligation and you have a 4 PC party, then it's 40. So the likelihood is that you're not going to trigger anybody's obligation. If you're running a table with 8 people, then maybe start off people with 5 obligation, because doing it 80% of the time might be a bit much. But that you can determine at your own table once we get into how to do this at D&D tables. But anyway, that's how it works. Rules as written is you roll, and then whoever it lands on, if it lands on somebody's range, their obligation is activated for the session, and their obligation is going to play a factor in that story. And there's some other mechanical things that affect them that we won't get into here because it doesn't serve our purposes for this conversation. But that is how it works. Now, a pretty common house rule that I think a pretty large subset of the community for this game has adopted is rolling obligation at the end of a session for the following session. So we've just got done playing, roll obligation, and now I, as the dungeon master, and you as the player whose obligation was just activated, both know going into the next session that your obligation is going to be activated, and gives me time to plan for that. I think that's a much better way of doing it, because as a dungeon master, I know I'm an agent of chaos and I love random tables, but I don't want to be a disservice to the player's story, me having to make something up on the fly for their personal struggle. So I like the idea of rolling at the end of the session. And now that we're getting into house rule territory, let's talk about how to use obligation in a D&D game. So obviously at face value, it seems very simple to take the initial concept of obligation and throw it into a D&D game. At character creation, you come up with your obligation, you start off with 10 points, and you move forward from there. You write your backstory, all that kind of stuff. But the wrinkle comes in, obviously, to how can players take on additional obligation at character creation? Because obviously, you don't need more experience points at character creation like you do in a narrative dice fantasy flight game system. So that's not really going to work. And you could do additional money to buy equipment if you want, whatever exchange rate you want to go with. Uh, you could do that certain amount of gold for 5 additional obligation or 10 additional obligation. I would max it out at 20. You don't want people walking out of character creation with 50 obligation, because, and this is another aspect of how it's done in Star Wars that you could choose to adopt, is when the party has an obligation of 100, like collectively, they can't spend experience points in the Fantasy Flight game system. They can't gain more abilities. They can't gain additional ranks and skills. So you could, if your party hits 100 obligation collectively, like there's no way that you can roll a D100 and not land on one of them, you could tell them that they can't level. Like, it's too stressful. They're on the run constantly. Like, every time they try to poke their head out the door, somebody from their past is coming calling. And so you could do that. You could say, so somebody's going to have to deal with their obligation a bit, because that is an additional part of obligation, is that when their obligation is activated, based on what happens in the story, can affect whether or not their obligation goes up or down, things like that. But we'll get into that into the running obligation part of this video later on. So anyway, if you want to be a little bit more punitive with it, I've never honestly run into a situation where the entire party has so much obligation that this happens. But you could express that to your players. If you all don't deal with this and it continues to accumulate, then it's going to have negative consequences. But anyway, having said all of that, cap it at 20 obligation at character creation. And I've come up with some ideas on things that you could offer the players if you want. You can do any one of these or offer all of them. And I think from a balance standpoint, it's okay. Maybe your mileage may vary. I haven't actually tested this at a table, but I think it's okay. So anyway, additional money obviously is the first thing. You could do bonus skill proficiencies. So you can get 1 additional skill proficiency for 5 obligation or 2 for 10 obligation. So doesn't seem too terribly overpowered. Maybe you restrict it to the proficiencies available by their class. Like, you can choose X number when you make this class. But if you want another one from that list, that way it keeps it kind of contained to the concept of their character. That is an option that you can do. And then for 10, like I said, you could offer 2. So maybe they start off with 4 skill proficiencies before they pick their background and all that stuff. I don't think that would be too game breaking. Obviously, there's going to be a bit of power creep in any of these because you're offering additional things to your players, but hopefully from a storytelling standpoint, there will be enough bad things, enough stuff coming at them to offset the additional power that they get from taking on the obligation. That's the whole idea of it, is that you're exchanging mechanical boost for narrative detriment. Once again, mechanics informing the story. That's why I like it so much. So if you don't run a particularly story-heavy game and your players don't care about the story, then maybe this mechanic isn't for you. But the type of game that I run, this mechanic is great. So anyway, skill proficiencies. You could also do a bonus feat. I would say plus 10 for 1 bonus feat. So if you're going to do this, you get 1 and then you're done. You can't get anything else. Or you could get an additional tool proficiency, plus 5 for 1, plus 10 for 2 if you want thieves tools or calligrapher's tools, chef's kit, whatever. Then you could take on some additional obligation to say that your character knows how to use those. Or you could do an extra weapon proficiency, 5 per weapon. I mean, this one really only comes into play if they want to take a weapon proficiency and then maybe a skill proficiency, because for 10, you could just take the weapon master feat and get 4 weapon proficiencies. So you wouldn't want to do 10 for 2 weapon proficiencies, unless that's what your player wants to do. But I feel like it's kind of a waste. And as a dungeon master, I would point out to them, you could do that, or for the same price, you could get a plus 1 bonus to your strength and 4 weapon proficiencies. But if not, totally fine. So those are a list of ideas that I had for things that you could offer to your players to increase their obligation at character creation in exchange for mechanical benefits. Are there any other things that you think would work well for this? Let me know down in the comments below if you think that anything like this would work. And before we continue, if you are liking this video, if you're finding it all helpful or interesting, please be sure to like the video, subscribe down below, and be sure to comment and let me know what you thought, if you have any additional ideas for mechanics that you think I should cover that you've stolen for your games. Also, if you would like to talk to me about this in real time, I do stream on Twitch every Sunday and Tuesday at 8 p.m. Central and Saturdays at 7 a.m. Come by, hang out and chat. I would love to have you. So when it comes to creating an obligation, there are 2 ways to really do it. Firstly, if you go look in the Edge of the Empire core rulebook, there is a list of obligations to pick from. And you can either go pick that book up and look at it, or you could come up with your own list. But if you're doing this, they should be intentionally open-ended and vague. Don't do a specific scenario, just give one-word prompts like betrayal, love, family, bounty, vengeance, things like that, addiction, uh, that will allow the player to then fill in the blanks and like take that spark of an idea and build something into their backstory that can really get them attached to it. The other way to do it, and I think this is interesting, once again, never done this in practice, but I might like to try this with a game that I run. Just have your players write their backstory, just like normal character creation. Tell them that you're going to use this mechanic, but just tell them, oh, well, we'll figure it out. So just go and write your backstory and get it to me. And then once they give you their backstories, then read them and find something. Pick something out and say, so your parents were killed by bandits, you said here, which kudos for the originality. So I'm thinking for your obligation, either maybe you want vengeance. Maybe there's a specific bandit leader that was behind the attack that killed your parents, and you want vengeance on this person, and it's your mission in life to kill them and bring them low. And obviously, as a dungeon master, you can make them very inaccessible for a long time in your campaign. Or you can say, or is your obligation honor? Maybe you have to go out of your way. If you see somebody in danger, if you see somebody who is about to suffer the same fate that your parents did or that you did, somebody that's about to lose their parents, you have to step in. Regardless of the danger to yourself, to your friends, to anybody around you, you are compelled to go help other people. That can be an interesting way to play it. Like offer them two options. Like which path do you want to walk? Honor, vengeance. And then they can still pick, and it really informs the type of character they're thinking of playing. So running obligation, what does it look like to actually get it on a table? So first off, I've been talking about numerical values and going up and down and all kinds of stuff. So when you're running obligation in the game, you basically, when you've activated somebody's obligation, this is the way that I do it. When you've activated somebody's obligation for a session and you're planning out the session, you're planning how their obligation is going to affect the situation present. And I'm going to get into how to plan that here in a second. But you basically need to come up with a success state and a fail state, essentially. And what I like to do also behind the curtain is come up with the win condition of the obligation. At what point has the player character satisfied their obligation? When has Han Solo paid off his debt to Jabba? Or when is his debt no longer an issue because Jabba explodes on a barge? And come up with the ideas of that. Like, how can this be dealt with? And keep that behind the curtain. Don't tell the player, oh, well, once you've done this, your obligation is done and over with. And then in the session, once you've determined, like, if they do this, then the obligation will go down by 5 or 10. In fact, you could create scales. If they do this, it goes down by 5. If they do this, it goes down by 10. And then also, if they do this, it goes up by 5. Their obligation increases, whether it's a debt or their sense of honor that they have to go help people. Like maybe they don't act quickly enough. Maybe they hesitate. They see somebody in danger, they hesitate, and that person dies because of it. Their obligation would go up. They feel guilty. They feel awful that they've done this. And maybe if they do save enough people, if they do go out of their way to protect people and their obligation goes down, they finally come to peace with the fact that maybe they've affected the world in such a way to where they don't have to put themselves in danger to protect people anymore. Maybe they realize that people at the end of the day can protect themselves. And so that's a positive way that the obligation can be resolved. And so that's the way that you keep the obligation moving up and down. And then if neither of the conditions are met, if none of those conditions are met, then the obligation just stays the same. They haven't done anything to affect the obligation in a meaningful way. So that's how you can do that. But if their obligation hits 0, if they resolve their obligation, then they have to come up with a new one, basically. Like with this mechanic, there's no scenario, unless you want to play it this way, unless you want to have a single obligation that they have to resolve over the course of the campaign, and then they can continue on. But if we're speaking purely in obligation terms, once Han Solo's debt is dealt with Jabba and he's rescued from the barge, his obligation switches to a sense of duty to the rebellion, or a sense of love for Leia, and that's why he goes whole hog in with the rebel attack. But his obligation shifts because at the end of the day, these player characters always have something that's driving them, and that's the idea behind this obligation, is what's driving them to continue on. So typically, the way that it's intended to be played is you're never absolved of any obligation. You're never absolved of any motivation to continue doing this, because at that point you retire and you go open a tavern. And so yeah, so that's how running obligation kind of works, and how I handle it in terms of how I determine when obligation goes up, goes down, and then when it's resolved. And then you can talk to the player about, okay, where is your focus shifting at this point? And there are three different ways, in my experience, three really good ways to plan your session and utilize obligation in the game when a player's obligation is activated. Now, first off, like I said before, there are some mechanical downsides in the Star Wars RPG when somebody's obligation is activated. And you could port something like that over, like maybe you gain, when somebody's obligation is activated, you gain 2 or 3, maybe equal to a proficiency bonus. Disadvantage, like you get to impose disadvantage on X number of rolls over the course of the session for that player, because they're having to deal with this and they're stressed and they're not having a good day. And so they're distracted because their obligation has come for them. And so that's a way that you can do that, to impose some kind of negativity mechanically onto the player to reflect the stress that they're feeling about their obligation activating. Now, I typically don't add that element to it because I figure the downsides from a narrative standpoint are enough to make the players stressed rather than the player character stressed. But if you want to have it be a little bit more mechanical in nature and pack that punch, you can incorporate that as well. So, actually planning the session. So first off, the way that you can do that is plan your entire session around that character's obligation activating. This is great for players who enjoy being in the spotlight, players who enjoy role playing, enjoy having that kind of front of the crowd role, having an entire session centered around their story and their character. It can be really good for them, but it does require a fair amount of reference points within their backstory for you to work off of. They have to have provided a rich enough story that you can build an entire session around it, knowing what the player intended. Because the last thing you want to do is take something that you think is kind of amorphous idea and codify it in a way that the player didn't want. So for obligation stories that maybe aren't as codified and concrete, I would go with option number 2, which is where the obligation interrupts the planned session, interrupts whatever the party was going to be doing. If they're raiding a dungeon, if they're saving a town, something like that, then their obligation comes to play and messes the job up, messes the adventure up in a way, or just has a big influence on it. Maybe that honor bound character whose parents were killed by bandits, they're trying to save a town and they're about to get all of these people out, or they're about to extinguish this building, and they hear from a building across the square some cries within the building, and they leave everybody to their own devices. They run off by themselves and run into this burning building because they hear somebody crying and hear somebody need help, and they have to do it. So that can be a way that their obligation is activated in the session in a very real way. Now, you don't want it to be kind of a one-off scenario like what I just described. That was just kind of off the top of my head. But you want it to be something that has a legitimate impact on the narrative. Just using an example from Eberron Renewed, the actual play podcast I mentioned earlier that uses this mechanic. One of the characters, Hob, has the bounty obligation. And there was an adventure we were doing where they were hired to for a train heist. Basically, they were hired to get something off of a train. So they go out the back, climb up to the top of the train. They're headed forward, and 2 bounty hunters essentially show up on the roof of the train looking for Hob. Obligation activated. We're doing a job. Everything's going well, and now, we have to deal with this. We have to fight on top of this train, hope that nobody hears or sees it. That kind of stuff. So that's what I mean when I say the obligation interrupts the session in a way. And this can be really good, like I said, for obligation stories that aren't the most fleshed out. Maybe one that you want to further define through play at the table. You want to develop that story through play at the table so that down the road you can have a whole session dedicated to that obligation. But you need to flesh it out a bit more before you can hit that point. And the last one is progressing the obligation story as kind of a side story of the session. It's a little bit more subtle of a way to have the obligation affect the session. But this works really well for the obligations that don't necessarily have combat or adventuring baked into them. Ones like, I adventure so that I can send money back home to help my sick brother, or someone wronged my family decades ago and I will have vengeance on them one day. That one can lead to combat, but probably not right away. You got to build up to it. So having obligation progress in a story sense is a really good way to do it. Once again, just because it's my best reference point for this kind of stuff, on Eberron Renewed, our last session activated one of our players' obligations, and I did it this way, like the story, that character's story as it relates to their obligation progressed. He discovered something about his late wife, and his obligation is vengeance on those who killed her. And so he found out information that will continue to fuel that need for vengeance. So yeah, that's a really interesting way to do it, and it requires a little bit less planning on your part to craft an entire session around a combat encounter or the entire session. You can just add this nice little through line in and continue on. So what did you all think? Did you enjoy this video? What do you think about obligation? Let me know down in the comments below if you're going to use it for your game or if you have further questions. If you do have further questions, a good place to go is our Discord. There's a link down in the description below where you can talk to me about this mechanic as well as all sorts of D&D stuff, or just food. We have a food channel, or pets. It's pretty great. So anyway, thank you all so much for watching. I've been Eric, and I will see you next time.